Hello, I'm Greg Castor, Hanson Peterson Chair in Liberal Studies and a member of the History Department at Gustavus Adolphus College. Last spring, my colleagues Yuri Hong in Classics and Margaret Block-Kazi in Biology collaborated on a fascinating interdisciplinary course titled Conceiving Reproduction, Nature and Society in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. A few weeks ago, I had the pleasure of speaking with them about their collaboration, and this is what they had to say.
So about 10 years ago, Margaret and I both gave faculty shop talks, and these are gatherings where faculty can present their research and everything. And we both presented talks on issues of reproduction. What was your talk on?
It was on female, so non-human female control of reproductive outcomes. So my interests are in how maternal condition or environment influences offspring quality, and I use a fruit fly as a model system to explore those questions.
And my presentation was on the representation of the reproducing female body in ancient Greek medical texts. And at the end of each of our presentations, we kept kind of coming up to each other and saying, that was really cool. Here's what I'm thinking of when I hear your talk. And there was some interesting points of connection. And for years, we'd kind of been saying we should teach a class together. And then when we worked on planning the Nobel Conference on Reproductive Technologies, that's when the idea started to come about that there are some classes that we could teach together and also in connection with Laura Barak and Maddalena Marinari's work, that we could do these 2 team talk classes and then link them in the spring following Nobel to carry that conversation forward. And so that became this great opportunity to actually do this thing that we'd been kind of, pie in the sky thinking about doing for years, actually. So.
What were the goals that you set for yourselves and the students in this course?
I think one was for us to be engaging in each other's discipline, and to have students see what that cross-disciplinary work is like within a class. As liberal arts students, they're learning about different facets of topics in different classes, but this was really an opportunity for them to work with faculty as we engaged in each other's disciplines and learned as well.
Yeah, so I think kind of for the students to see faculty being learners as well as teachers of material and engaging in that context. But also for students to get an idea of the ways in which, we think about science and humanities as so separate as disciplines, but in actuality, the intellectual process or the process of research where you frame a question or a topic, you try and figure out how you gather the data, what kinds of data to gather, how you analyze the evidence, and then you present those findings, you draw conclusions, you make an argument that actually, whether you're talking about science or whether you're talking about a historical question, those processes are actually quite similar, and that breaking down that kind of disciplinary divide was really important in demystifying what research looks like, and I think that's something that students really came away with, that they were surprised to find that that process, that doing research in the humanities is just as rigorous as doing it in the sciences, but in a really different kind of way and dealing with different types of evidence.
Just following up on that, was there anything that surprised you about the others' discipline as a result of your collaboration?
I just loved it. I there was so much I learned about kind of the classics and how, I think, kind of the nature of knowledge, how it's framed, and the idea for me about ideas that were articulated at that time that have kind of carried on through Western culture or parts of Western culture and are still with us today. And I think, one example of that is this idea of the wandering womb, which was definitely something that was happening in classic times about where a uterus might travel in a woman's body or be loose and how that might influence her behavior or her physical condition. And that we could find parallels. It's not the same thing, But when we're talking about endometriosis, that is about uterine tissue that's growing in essentially the wrong part of the body. And so being able to make some of those kind of conceptual connections was just a lot of fun.
Yeah, and the ability to kind of, identify when, maybe the detail of something is not correct the way that we would think of it, but the underlying concept still being an interesting theme that carries through, not because of an intentional thing, but yeah, so there were a lot of moments like that kind of came through where it was like, oh, like this sounds kind of like, how could they have believed this? But there's some kind of analog in, actual biological processes that do follow that same pattern of, and there's so many more examples that I could give of, where I know ancient ideas about the body that were like, that's totally not right. But then engaging with the actual biological processes and what we know about the body, from conversations with Margaret, I was really surprised to see the ways, and I learned a lot about
me too.
the way the body actually works, but that some of those ideas carry through. And the other thing that I was really interested in too was that Margaret was able to bring in all of these kind of case studies where we could talk about the ethics of science and how it's done and the kinds of things that scientists have tried to do to ensure mistakes that have been made, and then things that have been done to try and ensure that those mistakes don't get carried forward. And so that was really cool to see too.
What were the most challenging aspects of developing and implementing the course, actually teaching it?
For me, the challenges weren't in the teaching, but it was the time that was, and not that it was a challenge, but well, I mean, we're always time limited, I think. And so we put a lot of time in advance in trying to plan out the course. And I think that because we had been having these kind of conversations for a long time, there were a lot of topics. And it was about prioritizing topics and then figuring out some type of connection so that the course itself had integrity in terms of continuation of ideas. I think for me that was probably one of the harder parts of it.
Yeah, we had a lot of moving parts. Because you have two faculty members, you have two disciplines, two different types of evidence, but it was also linked to another team taught course. We also had two visiting scholars who we had to incorporate, and we're happy to, excited to incorporate them into the class. We also were trying to connect it to other things on campus that were happening, other visiting speakers. And so I think we got so excited that the main challenge was winnowing down. And that was really hard. It's kind of like choosing between your children because there
There were a lot of great ideas.
There were a lot of great
Perfect for the
ideas. And so, so I think that was the biggest challenge. And it's a good challenge to have. And I think both of us are looking forward to teaching it again and kind of seeing how we could make it focused and
How did the integration of the lab with the rest of the course work? Was it sort of a lecture and then they go to lab, or we should talk a little bit about that.
That's a good question. From my recollection of it, I think there were maybe two considerations that informed the lab. The first was that each of us had kind of a capstone project within the semester, and lab was one of the places, or maybe the primary place, where the biology research work was done. And then I think the other thing we were doing is looking at our topics and what topics we were covering within a week. Because I think the topics kind of went by week or by 2 weeks in a unit. And having a lab where students were then exploring that material in a different way. So there were labs that were case studies. There were labs where students were actually mucking about with flies and doing an experiment. And then there were labs that happened at, I guess, the library, where they were working on doing other types of research. So one thing I think we try to impress on the students is that research is research, and that they were learning about biology research, they were learning about research in classics, and again, finding these common themes, but that where we do that research, the place might differ, but we really tried, I think, while the labs were a little bit more biology-like, that this wasn't the place where you learn biology only.
And there were, especially early on, in some of these case studies where you're talking about, so what led people to do things in this way, like, scientists or medical practitioners to, I don't know, do medical training in this way or deliver babies in this way. What were some of the things that happened from that? Then the next day, that would take place in the lab, and then the next day we might talk about, doctor-patient relationships in these medical texts and how the doctors in this text were treating women and engaging with their female patients. And so there were sometimes, thematic points of connection there. But yeah, also kind of, thinking about so here's this kind of, in the lab you have lab partners and you're looking at the data together and you're creating this experiment. And then they also had to do their humanities research project was also in a group. And so they had to work together on different parts of, they each had different texts they had to bring to bear to this larger project that contributed to this idea that in the humanities, research is sometimes seen as you're in the library by yourself reading a bunch of books, but that even humanities research is kind of a group project, that different people are addressing different parts of a experiment, if you will, or a question that you're addressing, and you pull those things together to get at a group response or presentation of your findings. So.
And you mentioned that there were two scholars, right? And were they Nobel speakers? And do you remember their names? I assume
Yes.
who they were.
Alison Murdoch was a Nobel speaker,
Okay.
and Helen King was not a Nobel speaker, but she was there during the conference, and both of them were Rydell visiting professors.
And did they just sit in on the course, or did they actually participate? And if so, how?
They were full participants in the course.
They were part of the planning process.
Oh, that's great.
Via web most of the time, because they were both from Britain. And I mean, they led courses, or they led class sections and discussions, and there were times when there might have been, we may have been doing a little bit of instruction as well, but yeah, they were maybe not as much time as we were in the class, but they were there and part
That's
of it.
great.
Yeah, and they suggested some of the readings and things like that, and they could actually give us more from their own personal experience and their personal expertise, give us more of a background for where some of this stuff came from and what that looked like on the ground, especially in the case of Alison Murdoch. She could say, in my practice as someone who, does IVF and engages with patients and,
So she was a clinician in a fertility clinic and had gotten approval to do mitochondrial transfer, which is really a cutting-edge technology related to a reproductive technology. And so I think we had these wonderful kind of anchors to the disciplines that we could collaborate with. It was a wonderful resource for the students to be able to see here are what people who are really at the top of their game, how they engage. And how human they are.
Right. And then also how they came to be the experts at the top of their field, right? To be able to, I think it's one thing to see someone who's at the top of their field, but we oftentimes don't get, well, how did they get there? And Helen King, she talked a great deal about how she started as an undergraduate and how kind of one chance thing happened after another that took her in this whole new field that didn't really exist before her, to the degree that, to where she took it, and then also kind of, even further afield than classics and how she got into kind of, Renaissance science and modern 19th century science and the history of medical schools and all of that. So, so that was really cool, I think, for students to see that, they're people and that they have a backstory and that they didn't set out to become experts in their field, and they have families and challenges that they overcame, and kind of just worked hard and
That's terrific.
kept
Persistence,
at it.
resilience, some of the same things that we try to help our students foster.
And being flexible and taking a chance thing and then turning that into an opportunity rather than just leaving it as a barrier and ending there.
So this leads me to another question about the students, and what your sense is. I'm sure they enjoyed the class. Are there specific takeaways you're aware of the students had that really you think will stay with them, really meant a lot to them from the experience?
I mean, I can say maybe a little bit about some of the biology majors that were in the course, because I had conversations with them in other venues, and that the biology majors that were there have pre-health or health professional interests. And I think that they really valued the depth and kind of the richness with which they could look at medical procedures and medicine itself. You know, they certainly had an appreciation of kind of the culture from which our current medical practices have developed or evolved. And I think that for them, it was a way, again, of really anchoring their biology in a liberal arts perspective. And these students were seniors, and so they saw this as a type of capstone to help provide context for what for them in some ways is going to be a very pragmatic career. And so for me, you know, as a biology faculty member, like, I just loved that they had this chance to deepen and enrich their understanding of the biological world.
Were there classics majors too in that course?
We didn't have any classics majors, but I think the humanities students in that course, I think what was helpful for them and very empowering for them was that, you know, oftentimes humanities students are really like nervous about science classes, and it seems to them like a completely separate thing. And I think it was helpful for them to see the ways in which there are points of connection, and that science isn't just a collection of facts that you need to memorize off flashcards and you get quizzed on, and you know that there's a connection, there's a story there. There's a story of what's happening in the body. There's a story of what's happening with how people treat the body and engage with one another around these issues, and that there's real life consequences for how we understand the processes of reproduction, how we understand the way that science happens and scientific knowledge gets made, and that they have a lot to bring to the table in filling in some of those gaps and being able to say, you know, here's the historical context, or here's how ideas have developed, and things like that. So I think they found it a nice way to do the science and not feel like they were completely out of their element.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we weren't trying to kind of humanize science or legitimize the humanities. I think as I'm remembering this, I think that we were picking what we thought were really important kind of current topics, and to have students understand how perspectives from classics and perspectives from biology were powerful for understanding
The whole thing.
these things that are happening now. And so and I think that's important for students in the liberal arts to understand that these are different ways of knowing and also different ways of understanding our world, and that, you know, one somehow isn't more legitimate or more important than the other.
And you kind of need them both in order to
Yeah.
understand
Yep.
what the thing is.
What were some of just a couple of examples maybe of the student research done by both the bio majors and humanities majors?
So every student did 2 research projects, one in biology research and one in classics research. So maybe I'll say the biology and you can fill in. So what they did for the biology research is they were using fruit flies or pomace flies as a model system to look at how maternal condition influenced reproductive outcomes. And so some examples, a lot of students focused on changes in the diets of females and how that influenced their reproduction. So examples of projects included, I think one was ethanol, so alcohol consumption, how that influenced female reproduction, and that has a really direct connection to fetal alcohol syndrome and maternal alcohol consumption where there's an absolute kind of limit on women drinking here, but that's also cultural because there are other cultures where women do consume some alcohol during pregnancy. So kind of understanding that connection. There was another project that looked at nutrition, so looking at the ratio of proteins to carbohydrates and how each of those types of nutrients was important for reproduction. And then another group that decided to say, well, fruit flies don't drink ethanol, but there are more natural kind of fruit-based alcohols that they would be likely. And is it the same for a fruit fly to have that type of alcohol versus ethanol? So I think those were kind of the types of projects.
Yeah. So some of the projects that students worked on for their humanities project were things like looking at different embryological and gynecological texts, ancient medical texts, to look at different ideas about male and female contributions to the child. Like there were multiple theories about who was more responsible for the child's features and attributes, and who did the child belong to the most, or was it fairly equal? And so kind of they got a chance to look at multiple views to see that these were discussions that people were having in the ancient world that were sometimes influenced by society and cultural ideas of who the child belongs to, but then also kind of some scientific thinking about but what is the not evidence exactly, but acknowledging, well, sometimes kids look like the mom, and so wrestling with that in the face of against some kind of the societal structures that said who the kids belonged to. Another group looked at this idea of the wandering womb, and like where did that come from, and how did medical writers in the ancient period, but then also later, deal with this? Like, where did this idea come from? What was it used to explain in terms of women's bodies and their health, and also like their role in society? And another group looked at infertility, like where does infertility come from? How does it happen? Why does it happen? And then also, what are some of the things you can do in terms of in the areas of medicine, but also in terms of religion or ideas about magic, to try and remedy this condition, and how do they even think of it as a condition? And so they got to think about that in the ancient context, and then also kind of thinking about it in the modern context as well.
That all sounds fantastic. Had either of you team taught before here or elsewhere? Was this your first team teaching experience?
I had done what might be considered co-teaching, an introductory level biology majors course. So, I communicated with the other teacher, and we had kind of split the semester in two. So I had done that, but nothing that was as integrative, I think, and synthetic as kind of what we were trying to do with our course.
Yeah, in the department here, there's a class that oftentimes we teach called Historical Perspectives in the Three Crowns curriculum, and so two of our faculty members will collaborate to kind of put the syllabus together, but then we'll teach our separate sections. And those sections come together every now and again for content that's kind of common to both of them, but we're not usually in the same room having conversations. And so that model, I think, very much influenced the way that we taught it. We thought about the two linked classes, but in those scenarios, each instructor is kind of off in their own classroom for most of the time. And this was really different because you have two faculty members in the same room, so we could ask each other questions, and one of us would be kind of with the students saying like, wait, can you clarify this thing, because what was the hormones here again? Like, okay. and so I think that piece of it, I think, was interesting for students to see, like, oh, it's okay to, you can know a lot about this, and it's okay to have questions about that. And so that's what I think kind of made this so much more, synthetic and integrated experience.
So based on this experience, it sounds like you do it again, if I heard you. What advice would you have for some faculty pondering doing it for the first time?
Start early.
Start early.
Because I think when you're dealing with two people and two sets of information and topics, the more you can get started early, narrowing down. I think the better, because it's hard to do that on the fly in the way that you would just on your own. And we started early, and we did a lot of work in advance. And I don't know how we could have done it if we hadn't gotten that early start.
I think that that's really important for providing a cohesive experience to students. So it didn't seem like two parts, but instead they were two facets. I think something that had surprised me is how much I learned about teaching by teaching with Yuri or by being able to watch Yuri. So both in terms of technology used, but even just, I think I've been teaching long enough that I kind of have this idea in my head about how things go. And so it was really great for me to be able to be kind of constructively challenged of like, oh, I guess we don't have to do it that way. We have these other ways that we can collect student feedback or provide resources to students. And so I think I hadn't really anticipated, but very much appreciate the opportunity to be able to learn more about teaching and to kind of add some tools to my tool belt that way.
And that was totally the same for me as well. And that's something that I always knew that Margaret was an amazing teacher, but to be in the same room and kind of be like, oh, here's some activities that she's doing that, I could do that too in these other contexts. And so it was really, that was really, really cool. And so I think one of the things, you were asking a piece of advice to give to faculty who are thinking of team teaching, putting a lot of those tools out on the table, and then identifying which are the best tools to do for or activities to do for which kind of a topic, and really, just enjoying where it takes you, and then being on the same page about what are the main goals that we want students to cover. And I think one of the things, and this I think is the most important part, if you're thinking of team teaching, it's got to be with someone that you like and you trust and you feel you're compatible with, and it was so great to have someone that, if we got stuck on something, we're like, well, here's the challenge and how do we work together? And it was always, I knew that whatever Margaret suggested would be great, and that she would also be open to whatever I suggested, and we were kind of very clear about what our main goals were, and then it made it easier to kind of be like, okay, you know what, this is a great idea, but maybe for something else, because it doesn't serve our goals as much as this other thing. And so I think that's the most important thing, is someone that you can work with, and you're on the same page about your goals and working relationship.
And to have fun.
Exactly.
It was just really fun to kind of be in that space, learning with students and learning from each. Yeah, it was lovely.
Yeah.
And then lastly, what about resources? This takes time, obviously, you mentioned that, but in the context of Gustavus in particular, were resources made available to you to facilitate the planning, the teaching, etc.?
Yes. So we got, I think, wonderful support from the Provost's office in terms of supporting the time it takes for 2 individuals to teach a course. And they kind of honored, I think, the work that it takes to develop that. And there were mini grants through the Kendall Center for Engaged Learning that supported us developing this new course. So I think that was helpful.
Yeah.
There were other things I'm trying to remember.
Definitely, the fact that the Rydell visiting professors were a crucial part of this whole project. And so that covered bringing the Rydell scholars, and it also supported us having these kind of mini conference presentations that students did at the end of the semester. That the both classes came together and they presented to each other, and we made it kind of like a conference. And so there was some drinks and snacks and mingling time. We're supposed to network, and so those kinds of fun things. And so that, I think, that kind of support, I think, was really useful too. And so we kind of pulled from different areas.
Thank you both so much. It sounds fantastic. And
Thanks.
we look forward to the next iteration.
Thank you.
Thank
So do
you.
we.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you, Benjamin.